What follows is an interview with John St. George Creaghe regarding his experiences as a First Lieutenant, Company B, 85th Mountain Regiment, 10th Mountain Division in World War II. John was born April the 14th, 1921, and died at age 90 on June the 28th, 2011. This interview was conducted in 2004 at his home in Santa Rosa, California. Okay, just for the record, this is April the 17th, 2004. We're interviewing John S. Creaghe, First Lieutenant, Company B, 85th Regiment, 10th Mountain Division during World War II.
Yes.
When were you born? What was your date?
April 14th, 1921.
1921. All right. Well, we're going to confine our comments today to the World War II type experiences. You started college in 1939.
Yes.
What was the atmosphere at the college? Did you feel like there was war coming? What was the overall atmosphere?
Well, actually, we were all pretty unconscious. But when it really came home was December the 7th, 1941, when the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor. And I can remember exactly where I was. I was walking down the corridor in the fraternity house, and somebody had the radio on. I heard it. And I can even remember the clothes I was wearing. And that was the days, those were the days when even college students wore hats. I had on a felt hat. Those memories you never forget.
Okay. How did things change around campus after that?
Well, the next day, which was a Monday, virtually the whole fraternity went down to Denver to various re-enlistment things, whether if they thought they wanted to be in the Navy or the Marines or the Air Force or the Army, and tried to enlist, and a lot did. But most of us that did enlist went into the E7 or one of those other things, which they wanted us to finish school so they'd have a large pool from which to draw officers.
Is that what you did?
Yeah.
E7. How did you enlist for that? What was the...
Well, I went down, I'll make it brief. First, I tried to join the Marines, and they said, well, your eyesight isn't good enough. I waited 6 weeks, and I went back and tried again, and this time I got through the eye exam, but they said, oh, you have a varicose vein in your leg, you'll never be able to do all the marching you have to do. So then I knew I would never get into the Air Force, so I went to the Army and said, I want to enlist, and they said, well, the Army Infantry is the place for you, and that was fine with me.
Okay. Why were you interested in the Marine Corps? Why'd you try two times?
Well, because, the Marines have that aura. They certainly did then, and they still do. That's where the action is going to be.
So you wanted to be where the action was?
Oh, yeah. That was my whole temperament. Once I got into the Army, once I got into combat, if I hadn't been wounded on Dallas Bay, I'm sure I would have been killed further down the line, because I wanted to be up front, even though as the company executive officer by that time, I was supposed to be in the rear, but I couldn't stay back there. I went up with Carl Caracas and in essence took over my old platoon, the first platoon, and that's where I wanted to be.
Why?
Because that was my temperament. I wanted to be where the action was. In a situation like that, you're not afraid anymore. The only fear I ever felt was before an action started. Then I was really sick at the stomach and everything else, but once the action started, all of that dissipates, and you think only of now, what am I supposed to do here? What will I do here?
Did you know you were going to be like that? Were you like that in other things in your life before you joined the military?
No, I found out though when I went to basic training, we fell out the first morning for calisthenics, and I thought, this is for me, you know. I want to be a good soldier. That was my overriding concern from the day I went in.
When did you actually join the Army after December 7th?
Oh, it was probably about December the 20th, long in there.
And when did you go to basic training?
April, and I don't remember the date, but it was in April sometime. And I had, by that time, I'd finished the second quarter, and CU gave everybody a quarter, a freebie. And so I, in essence, graduated then too.
Okay, so you actually graduated from CU before you went?
Yeah.
Okay. So did you go in as an officer?
No, I went in as a buck private. Never did really give much thought to being an officer, though I did ride by the officers' club on the bus once, and I thought, well, that'd be a good way to go. But the first inkling I got, the company commander called me in and said he wanted to recommend me for Fort Benning Officer Candidate School. Was I interested? You know, I leaped like a trout for that, and I was, of course, really pleased.
Mm-hmm. And where did you did basic where?
At Camp Walters, Texas.
Camp Walters, Texas.
Camp Walters, Texas.
And then from there you went?
From there I went to Fort Benning, to OCS, and from there I went to the 10th Mountain Division.
Okay, so they identified you in basic training as officer material?
Yes.
How long had you been in it before they asked if you wanted to go to OCS?
Oh, maybe 2 months.
Okay. And from the first day you decided this is something you wanted to do?
Oh, yeah.
So did you find basic difficult?
No, I loved it. I found that I had enormous physical endurance, and the sergeant that was in charge of our platoon made me the acting sergeant for that platoon, and after that basically I was the one that had control of the platoon and fell them in and fell them out and all that sort of thing.
What was the interview like when they were trying to decide if you should go to Officers Candidate School?
Well, I walked in and saluted, and they said, sit down, and one of them was a kindly old colonel. The other was a captain, and the third one, I don't remember what he was like, but they asked me some, I would say, perfunctory questions, and then the old colonel said, well, if you were pinned down by a machine gun, what would you do? And I said, I'd call for an airstrike. That's what we all thought, you know. And he said, well, suppose that didn't work. Well, what would you do? And I said, well, I'd take it out.
And they liked that answer.
Oh, yeah, he smiled. I suppose that's probably what, you know, that was the end of the interview as far as they were concerned.
So you finished basic training, then went to OCS school.
Yeah.
What was that like? What did you do there? What were the...
Well, it was about, well, what they call us, 19-week, I don't know, but it was about 3 months, between 3 and 4 months. And that was easy too, and the men, the other soldiers that were in my platoon in basic training were all ROTC graduates, from many of them from the University of Mississippi and Georgia and so on, and they didn't know anything about how to field strip a rifle, how to do this, how to do that. And so when they found out that I'd gone through basic training, they were all very interested for me to show them, you know, how to field strip a rifle and how to do this with a machine gun, you know, all of that, which, you know, and I enjoyed being a teacher.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you finished that as a second lieutenant.
Yeah.
And your first assignment?
My first and only assignment, really, until I was wounded, was the 10th Mountain Division. And I was assigned to Company B, 85th Mountain Infantry, 10th Mountain Division, and that's where I stayed.
Okay. Where did you report after officer? Where did you join up with the 85th?
At Camp Hale.
So that was already up and running?
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
okay, all right. Was that a volunteer outfit or were you assigned?
Yeah, it was largely volunteer then, but as the war progressed and they had to send cadre out of the division elsewhere, including enlisted men, we began to get a large number of draftees.
Why did you volunteer for the 10th Mountain?
Well, I guess mainly because it was located in Colorado. And I didn't know anything about skiing or mountaineering. I'd never had on a pair of skis.
Tell me about Camp Hale. What was it like when you first got there? How did you get there, and what was your first impression?
Well, I suppose I got there by bus, but I don't really remember. But to me, it was just an army camp, you know, a lot of snow, the mountains, and all the rest of it.
As far as you remember, was it completely built up when you were...
Largely, yes, it was.
Okay. Now, as a second lieutenant, did you take over first platoon?
Yeah, and the third day I was there, we were supposed to have a week to acclimate. But the third day I was there, they said, okay, Lieutenant, you're going to take out a beginner's class in snowshoeing. I never had a pair of snowshoes on. I didn't know how to put them on. And one of the other soldiers that knew something about it helped me strap into them. And we took off for an hour snowshoe trek. None of the people with me knew anything about snowshoeing either.
Where did you learn to ski?
Right there at Camp Hale. Shortly after that, I had to go on an all-day forced march on skis with my platoon. And I didn't know anything about skiing. Every time I tried to turn, I fell over into the snow, which was a great source of amusement to the soldiers that knew how to ski. But in fact, one of them told me later at one of the reunions, I was sliding down this gentle slope and I couldn't stop, so I disappeared to his side in a clump of trees. And he said everything was quiet and everybody just stood and looked and wondering if this fool had killed himself. And he said all of a sudden the snow around the conifers started to shake, and I emerged, and he said, I said right then, I'll follow this officer anywhere.
So did you ever receive any formal instruction from all these fantastic skiers that were in the 10th Mountain?
No, not really. They just expected that you'd put on a pair of skis and learn.
Okay. Do you remember the date you got there? I assume it was 1943 that you arrived.
It was, I think it was December the 15th.
Of 1943.
Yeah.
Okay, so then, what were your quarters like?
Well, the officers' barracks were, every officer, it was just a big barracks, but we all each had a separate room. And in my room, this was really the luck of the draw. I walked in and some previous occupant who obviously could draw had drawn a life-sized picture of a reclining nude on the wall. And it was very realistic and very erotic.
I assume you were the envy of the BOQ then.
I was glad I had that room, remember what a woman looked like.
Now, the people that you picked up on first platoon on day one, were they the ones you trained with throughout the entire time?
Yeah, I was very fortunate. I got a platoon sergeant, Sergeant Porky Porgio. He was an Italian from the Bronx, and he treated me wonderfully from day one. And a lot of times these non-coms that had been in for a while, a new lieutenant took over, and they were known to give you a hard time. But he was helpful, respected the rank, never any trouble, just a perfect platoon leader.
Okay. Did you make friends right off the bat with fellow officers?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Joe Brigandi, who was transferred later to another, I think another regiment, he and I became good friends, and an officer named Wilbur Prime, and there were others, but you know, many were transferred and so on.
So then about 3 months after you got there, the D-series training came along.
Yes.
Were you prepared for that? Were you
Well,
an accomplished skier by then?
By that time, we'd been doing an awful lot of mountaineering, you know, rappelling, rock climbing, skiing cross country, snowshoeing, carrying that heavy pack. So, well, we were in shape, and you know, I was what, 22. You know, I was in perfect condition. You know, I weighed about 175 pounds. I could go all day and all night if necessary.
Did you take to this kind of training the same way you took to basic training?
Yeah, yeah. I loved doing my best in whatever situation I was in. That was my whole temperament.
Okay. So tell me about D-series.
Well, we loaded up our rucksacks with everything in the world, and they weighed, as I remember, about 75 or 80 pounds. And when we could walk, we had the skis strapped to the packs, but once we got into the snow, we'd put on the skis and trudged on.
So this was what, 3 or 4 weeks out there?
Yeah, yeah. The officers, though, every week were brought back to Camp Hale to attend a seminar on what had transpired and where the weaknesses were and so on. And I used to spend a few minutes rushing into the PX and buying all the candy bars that I could carry. And I'd take them back and dole them out among the platoon, keeping a good amount of them for myself. And, you know, in that kind of an environment, you can consume huge amounts of sugar. And I used to eat probably 2 or 3 candy bars a day as long as I had them.
Did you suffer frostbite or anything? Did you have any injuries from that?
No, I was very fortunate. There were people, though, that got bad frostbite in their fingers and so on.
I understand the weather was particularly bad during that.
Yeah, in night it got down to, as I remember, around 30 below. And, you know, our beds were pine boughs with our sleeping bags spread on top of them. Because in the D series, you didn't, as I remember, we didn't ever pitch tents.
Did you dig snow caves, or were you just...
Well, Bobby Lee, who was one of my squad leaders, and I were sent out on a listening post where we could look across the valley. And we were out there for 3 days, so we took a tent with us, 2 tents as a matter of fact. And he and the other soldier that went with us were in one tent, and then I had another one. And we were all dressed in white camouflage outfits. And it was a nice vacation, really. We just sat around and ate and looked across the valley to do what we thought we ought to be doing. One thing I remember, you know, we'd had heavy snow, and a lot of those fairly steep slopes, they were ready to slide any time. And we watched across the valley as I guess it was a platoon from another company skied across that treacherous area, and we were thinking all the time, my God, I hope it doesn't slide, you know, because if it had, the whole platoon would have been dead. But they made it across.
What was a routine at Camp Hill? Did you train every day? What was your routine?
Oh, well, we trained every day Saturday up until noon. Then we were off Saturday afternoon and all day Sunday.
What did you do in the off time?
Oh, the officers club was down there, and mainly we'd sleep, rest, put on our dress uniforms, go down to the officers club, have a few drinks, a nice meal, go home and go to bed.
Did you ever go to Denver or anything on that time off?
I went to Denver only once. Some people that had access to cars and maybe their wives were nearby or something, they were going down to Denver all the time, or to Leadville, which wasn't very far away. But all the time we were at Camp Hale, I never once got to Leadville. I really didn't have any desire to leave the camp. I enjoyed the life there, and the weekends I thought were wonderful, just to be able to relax and eat at the officers club and all that.
Okay. Were you aware of a certain, did you guys have, I should say, a certain esprit de corps? Did you think of yourselves as an elite outfit?
Yes, we did. Yeah, we did. Importantly, because the whole initial cadre were accomplished mountaineers, many Dartmouth graduates, and from other schools where there was skiing, and they regarded themselves as an elite group, and we began to regard the division as an elite group, and I think it was so considered in the Army.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Now, according to what I've read, in September 1944, you guys were transferred to Camp Swift. Did you know there was a deployment coming? How did you guys were there for 2 years. Did you ever wonder when you were going to be deployed? Were there rumors going around?
Oh yeah, we always expected it, and we'd get this rumor, but nothing would come of it, and then another rumor and so on. But when we got the rumor at Camp Swift, and the orders came down to start, getting everything ship shape and starting to pack equipment and so on, we knew it wasn't going to be long then.
Okay. Now, I don't see a lot of leave in here. Were you ever able to go back home to your hometown in Lamar, Colorado at any time after you enlisted?
Yeah, I did. I had a 10-day leave when we were at Camp Swift, and I went home then. But all of those things to me are a blur, because I was so totally oriented toward the 10th Mountain Division and what I was doing there that I don't remember too much about the time when I was away from the division.
Interesting. But you did go home that 10-day period?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you remember at all how your parents felt about you and your brother going off to war? Do you remember that at all?
Yes, but they were proud that they had sons in the military. My brother, an officer in the Navy, and I, an officer in the Army. They were very proud about that.
Did you and your brother ever see each other?
Yeah, when we were at Camp Swift, Larry, for some reason, was going to be in, I guess it was Dallas. In Dallas, and he contacted me, and I was able to get a compassionate pass or whatever it was for 3 days, and I went to Dallas, and we had part of the day together, and a good dinner that evening, and the next morning, and then he had to go on to his station, and I went back to Camp Hale, or Camp Swift.
Now, the books that I read described Camp Swift as the most unpleasant experience. What is your recollection?
It was hot and dusty and just humidity sometimes, and other times no, and it was not a pleasant place, particularly since we just come from Camp Hale and we're pretty much adjusted, psychologically and physically to that, and then come down there to that Texas heat. It was miserable.
When you left Camp Swift, did you know you were going to Italy? How specific was your knowledge about where you were going?
I suppose we knew, but I don't remember whether we knew or not. But I think we got on the trains and Found out we were headed, I think it was Newport News, I'm not sure now. And of course, once we got there, we boarded the SS America, which was a luxury liner that had been converted to a troop ship. And we were packed in there like sardines.
What were your quarters like as an officer?
Well, I shared a small cabin with either 9 or 10 other officers, and the men were down below the water line in these compartments, you know, a whole platoon in a compartment that was not very large, and we ran into rough weather, and those that were susceptible to seasickness, it was sad, you know. They were vomiting into their helmets, and up at on the mess deck where everybody ate in shifts. I'm not exaggerating. The hallway outside the mess deck was probably 3 inches deep in vomit. Oh, it was awful.
How long did that last? How long was the trip over, and how long was it like that?
Well, it seems to me it wasn't like that for too long, because, you know, they were able to get cleaning crews going from among the soldiers and from among the sailors, and once everybody had emptied his stomach out, probably many of them only ate sparingly after that.
Did you get seasick?
I felt queasy, but fortunately I didn't ever get to the point of vomiting.
When there was a routine day on the troop ship, what was it like?
I can't tell you, because we were so busy and under so much stress that you only have little episodic memories.
What were you doing that was causing busyness and stress?
Well, one night, and I was slept down in the hold on my shift with the men in the platoon. It was a really stormy night, and these waves had hit the side of the ship, and it sounded like really a telephone pole battering ram hitting the sides of that ship. And once when we were down there at night, they got a submarine alert. Well, I'll tell you, if I had ever been frightened in my life, I was scared to death.
You say when you went down, did officers go down periodically? Was there always an officer down in the hold?
Yeah, we had, it seems to me we had three or four shifts a day, and when your shift was on, you were down there for 6 hours or 8 hours, whatever it was.
Was there any opportunity for the soldiers to get up and walk around the ship, or were they pretty much?
Occasionally, yeah, and some of them would be rotated so they would get all the way up and be able to walk on the deck for a while, but they didn't get too much of that. It was miserable.
What kind of shape were you in physically when you got there? You went on that ship as a finely tuned athlete. What were you like when you got off?
Very grateful to get off. That's all I can tell you. But we pulled into the harbor in Naples, and that's the first time I'd seen what war leaves behind. There were stacks of sunken ships sticking up out of the water, and all of the buildings around the harbor were just rubble. And when our turn, that is my platoon, our company had our turn to unload, debark, the first sight that met my eye was an old Italian man squatting, relieving himself right along the path where we were going up to wherever we went.
Okay. Tell me some more about the Italian people that you ran into. How long it had been since Naples had been leveled like that?
It was, I don't remember when it was, but it had been a long time anyway, because the battle had moved from that area up to beyond Pisa. Mm-hmm. Which is beyond Florence.
So how did the Italian people look? Did they look stunned? Did they look like they were recovering? What kind of...
Well, the only ones we really saw, because they were not supposed to be allowed into wherever we were bivouacked, were these poor young girls, like, you know, 14, 15, 16. They were there begging for food and promising favors. And it was sad, you know, because they were malnourished and bad complexions, and you hated to see people reduced to that level of privation.
Now, once you got off the ship, were you moving continuously up to the front lines, or were there pauses in the action?
We got off the ship, and I guess we were probably billeted in the remains of a warehouse, and the next day a whole group of landing craft infantry pulled into the harbor, and a platoon at a time boarded those, and we went off up the coast to, I suppose, to Pisa, I'm not sure. And that took a good while, and we were on the landing craft at night, and the first time I'd ever seen the ocean, you know, that close. In the wake of the ship, the turmoil in the water activated these animals that glowed, you know, and so the wake was just like stars, a myriad of stars out there. That really impressed me. I'll never forget that.
So that was a landing craft infantry LCI.
Yeah,
How big is that?
Oh, as I remember, it was probably 50 or 60 feet long, and maybe, I don't remember, 10, 15 feet wide.
What was the accommodation for your platoon? Were people standing? Could they sit on the floor? What was?
No, they had a lot of bunks. These places had been fitted out for, you know, ferrying troops around, as well as, and there were probably others that weren't fit out that way, that were used for the actual landings. But I remember when we went on board, of course there were 3 or 4 young Navy officers in charge of the ship. They were the same age we were. And they said, well, you officers, however many of us there were, will eat here with us. And the men ate in a different section of the ship. And they said, well, for dinner tonight we have horse cock and cheese. Cheese and bologna. That's another thing I'll never forget.
So you dined like a Navy gentleman.
Yeah. But they weren't eating any better than we were, at least at that time there.
Okay, so that was like an overnight trip.
Yeah.
Okay. Then, when did you? Take me from there up to the Mount Gorgolesco battle. What was going on in that time period?
First we debarked at Pisa and were taken by truck. Well, maybe we marched, I don't remember, to a bivouac area where we spent, I don't know, several days and nights picking up final equipment, you know, ammunition and all that sort of thing. And during that time, the weather was pretty nice, though it was February. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we were able to, you know, get leave during the day, and a couple of other officers and I went to Pisa, and we were able to take the stairs up to the top of the leaning tower and ring the bell. And there was nobody, you know, really watching the place, and everybody that got up there rang one of the bells a few times, which I thought was a bad scene because we probably ended up cracking the bell or something.
Okay. Now, when you finally got fitted out, what did you carry into combat yourself? How were you armed?
Well, I was supposed to carry an M1 carbine, but they were puny guns, you know, and so I carried an M1 rifle, just like all the infantry soldiers carried, which was a wonderful, trustworthy weapon, and you knew if you needed it, it was going to work.
How much ammunition?
Well, as much as we could comfortably carry, but before an attack, we would always drop our packs and they would sometimes make it up to where we finally ended up. But the very first battle, which was Mount Gordalesco, my pack never did get there. So the next day we were patrolling around, and there was a dead 10th Mountain man that his comrades, while he was still alive, had put into his sleeping bag. So, you know, we didn't scruple about it. We gently took him out of the sleeping bag, and I kept it and used it for my own. You know, one of the things that really struck me, though, with that soldier, and then others that I saw, and German soldiers, so often they were dead, but there was no discernible mark on them. I suppose if they were killed instantly, there wasn't much blood, and many weren't blown to pieces or anything, just maybe a few pieces of shrapnel hit them somewhere.
Were you a first lieutenant by that point?
Yes, I was.
Were you still a platoon leader, or were you?
I was the first platoon leader of the first platoon.
As a first lieutenant?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, now, in your friends, whose name I can't pronounce,
Carl Caracas.
Caracas describes a patrol, it sounds like, that you were on, where the colonel was unhappy with the way things were going. Tell me about that.
Bruce Coggins, who was also a dear friend, and I were given command of this 50-man combat patrol, and our objective was up in the mountains where it was nothing but snow, because there was a lot of activity up there, and they couldn't figure out what was there, so they wanted us to go up there and, if possible, knock out whatever was up there. So we left Montefigatese, where we were billeted, this little village, and marched all night down the path that we couldn't see, but I guess whoever was leading us could. We all had luminous tags on the back of our packs, and we followed that luminous tag in front of us. Then when daylight came, we were where we could assemble out of sight of that mountain area, and we got all ready to go there, and Bruce and I took the thing out and went up as high as we could without getting into the vision field of whoever was up in the German setup. And during the night, we had to spend the night then. It snowed. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and when the time came to jump off, we'd been given a 9 o'clock thing, it was snowing so hard we couldn't tell where we were. So I was in charge, and Bruce was the second in command in the platoon. I said, well, we're going to stay right here until this snow stops, so we'll orient ourselves and then go on. Well, that's what we were doing, and we were supposed to break radio silence, but suddenly radio silence was broken, and it was Colonel Woolley, the battalion commander, who, by the way, never liked me for reasons I don't know. But anyway, he said, Creaghe, where are you? I told him, he said, why aren't you on the objective? And I explained why, and he said, you're relieved. Turn that platoon over to Coggins, and you report back to battalion headquarters as fast as you can get here. I turned to Bruce and I said, you heard him, but I said, I'm not leaving. I'm going to go with you. You're in command now. And he said, no, I'm not. You brought it this far. You're going to take it the rest of the way. Which I did. And when we got up there, I don't know, I suppose it was around noon, and fortunately, the 13 men that were in this little outpost, and they had a really nice bunker, And I can see why they were inside resting, and they never expected anybody. But we hadn't made any noise, and we spread out in a perfect skirmish line across the snowfield. And I thought, God, if they ever find out we're here and have any time at all, we're all dead meat. I was over on one flank, and there was a steep drop-off. I slipped, and all of a sudden I was sliding down this thing. I couldn't even see the troops. Fortunately, I was able to stop myself, and I was carrying, at that time, foolishly, a submachine gun, and the submachine gun hit on something, and the bottom dropped out of the ammunition drum, and all the ammunition fell out. But the first thing, I stopped myself, and a soldier came to the edge and peered over, and I said, go, go. I managed to get up there in no time at all, and we went right on up to the objective, and they were still inside, unaware that we were there. And in the meantime, Bruce Coggins had set up the machine guns back where he had an overlook, so that if they had discovered us, hopefully, he might have been able to neutralize them. But anyway, somebody spoke German, and he shouted at them to come out, their hands up. Well, unfortunately, it turned out that they were Italians, and they refused to come out. So we threw a few grenades up on the roof, and that still didn't shake them up enough so they'd come out. And then one of the young soldiers said, "Lieutenant, I've got a thermite grenade. I'll go around to the front and throw it in the door." Well, we covered him, so. And he went up there, and gutsy kid, you know, a lot of things like that happened, and you wish that at the time you'd been able to take their name, rank, serial number, and recommend them for something, but there was so much action, you weren't even thinking in terms of that. This kid threw that thermite grenade through there, and he threw it, and the next instant it came sailing out. And, well, of course, everybody ducked, and that thing exploded, and you know what they were like. It was terrible. But anyway, the soldiers inside decided they would surrender. And so they waved something white out, and we told them, come out, and it turned out there were 13 of them there, as I remember.
Did you lose any men on that?
Not a man scratched. Not a shot fired, in fact, except the grenades that we threw on top, and then the thermite grenade that the kid threw in through the door. And you know, I'm grateful to this day that one of those Italians got to that thing and threw it out before it went off, because my God, that would have been terrible, you know. 11, 12, 13 men in a hut.
Was that before Italy had surrendered, or?
No, yeah, that was before the Italians surrendered.
Okay. What did the colonel say when you guys got back?
Well, he said, report to my headquarters the next day. And what could he say when I got there? I mean, it was a wonderful success. Nobody got hurt. We took, I'll say 13 prisoners. It was 11, 12, or 13. What was there to say, you know? But he said, Creaghe, I'm going to be watching you from now on. And I said, yes, sir. I saluted and left.
Now, was the snow deep that you guys are walking through, or you weren't on skis?
Well, it was on our skirmish. Well, yeah, it was up to here. Mm-hmm. You know, it was hard moving. And, you know, and we formed this skirmish line and moved across this snowfield, and you know, that took a little while. I can't tell you now how long it took, but probably at least a couple of minutes, and boy, you're out there exposed.
Okay. Then from that point, what developed there?
Well, after that combat patrol, shortly after that was when we moved into an assembly area to launch an assault on Mount Gorgolesco. And our objective was one of the ridges that ran off of Mount Gorgolesco. And I don't remember what the name of it was, but everybody refers to it as Gorgolesco.
Okay. Now, that was all part of the Riva Ridge Mount Belvedere
Yeah.
operation. Were you aware that that Riva Ridge thing was going on? How much, and as a corollary to that question, how much are you aware of what's going on in the whole operation?
Very little, very little. In the first place, even you're briefed, of course, but what you're interested in and focused on is what do we do? Because as far as you're concerned, that's what counts.
Mm-hmm. Now, so when did you guys push off or start or whatever you call it?
Oh, it was a nighttime assault, which was basically a fiasco. Carl Caracas kept a diary during the time we were over there, and this is from February the 19th. Night attack, no ammo and weapons, bayonets and grenades only. Much confusion. 1st and 3rd platoons lose many men. Pitiful slaughter. Take objective around 5:30. Lieutenant Creaghe takes final objective single-handed, a seemingly impossible feat. And then he goes on.
Okay, so tell me about it.
Well,
What's the no ammunition? Tell me about that.
Well, foolishly, they didn't want us to have any ammunition in our rifles. You know, we had ammunition with us because they were afraid we'd be shooting each other in the dark. Well, as it happened, we got close to our objective. I suppose it was about midnight, and German machine guns opened up all over the place. All you could see were tracers, and everybody, including myself, hit the dirt, and there we stayed the rest of the night. And periodically the Germans would fire grazing fire, and one of my squad leaders, who was right in front of me, he whispered, "God, Lieutenant, I'm hit." Well, even though he was lying prone, the machine gun bullet had entered that big back muscle and exited along the same muscle. It hadn't hit any bone or anything. Well, I was able to get to my first aid kit, and I got a compress, a bandage, and worked my hand up under his shirt and put that over the only wound that I was able to find, and that was all I could do. And I told him, I said, crawl back to where it's safe, and then walk back to the aid station, and that's what he did. And he came through okay.
So was it like you could see tracers going over you?
Oh, it was hell. You lay there. I wasn't afraid in the sense that you think of fear. I was just thinking, if they hit me, I hope it's quick and easy, And people, occasionally somebody would scream, in situations like that. It's just pitiful. Well, as soon as it got light enough to see, everybody some of them had been able to scratch out a depression, even lying on their side, and were in that. Well, I could see where the one machine gun that was really bothering us was located. I didn't see any people, but I could do where it was, and I thought, well, I've got to get it. And there was a young kid John Shields was next to me over there, and I could tapped him on the helmet and said, you know, cover me. And I crawled about, I suppose, 40 feet up this fairly gentle slope to where I knew the machine gun was. When I got there, I saw this little parapet, and I had my M1, and I'd loaded it during the night. And I jumped up, and there they were, 4 of them sitting behind this machine gun. Fortunately for me and unfortunately for them, they had not been alert. And I emptied that M1, 8 rounds. I can see them yet, you know. They jerk and they quiver and they, oh, it was terrible. I still think about that. Those are the only people that I know that I killed, and it's not a pleasant thing. Because I had no grudge against Germans per se, as Carl Caracas didn't either. He and I talked about that later, and said no, they were doing their duty just like we were doing our duty.
Why do you think they weren't alert?
Oh, they'd probably been there all night, and they probably thought they'd killed most of us, because there were a fair number of dead people lying around. And I don't know, maybe they thought we'd retreated in the night. I don't know what they thought.
So basically you spent the night 40 feet away from a German machine gun that was shooting at you?
Yeah, flat on my stomach. And you know what I thought as I was crawling up there? I said, dear God, don't let me take the burst in the face. There was something about having my head blown to bits that horrified me, the thought of it. But fear, it wasn't fear, it was just total concentration, and I hope it happens this way.
So you were standing there exposed, you shot these guys,
Yeah.
and then what happened?
Well, I started screaming at them, you know, come on, come up! And some of them got up and started, and then others got up, and the first thing, probably not more than a couple of minutes, everybody was up. There was a waist-high trench line dug all along here, and we were all in that, and we saw just off to the left in a little cul-de-sac, there was a stack of brush, and the brush was quivering. So I walked over, and with the barrel of my rifle, I flicked the brush aside, and there was this little kid in there. He was a soldier, but he did not look like he was 14 years old, and he was just scared to death. Well, I mean, I just waved him to the rear, and then there was a dugout down the slope, and we knew there were people in there, but by this time, you know, they didn't dare stick their head out because we had everything aimed at that. And one of our kids that spoke some German shouted at them to come out. And first they wouldn't do it, so we put a few machine gun rounds through the door, and they came out. There was a young officer, and I don't remember how many men, and we took all of them prisoner and sent them to the rear. And that was the last real action that we saw in connection with Mount Gorgolesco. But one of the beautiful sights after we took our objective, then it was C Company moved out from where they were, and a beautiful skirmish line went up the slopes of Mount Gorgolesco to the top and then disappeared over the top. And about that time, then Germans started coming back from where they'd been overrun by C Company. And I remember one had a gaping wound in his shoulder, which wasn't, and he was an old man, really. He was an old man, white beard, you know, stubble, and his hair was white. And oh my God. And and his snowsuit pants had fallen down around his ankles, and he was afraid to stop to try to get him off for fear somebody would shoot him. And the fellow with him, you know, they were like that. So we helped him out of his snowshoe thing and sent him on to the rear. But he wasn't bleeding much, but I could see that wound yet. It was huge. But anyway.
Now, were these crack German troops, or what kind of, you described
Well,
an old man and a boy.
I know, but we heard that we were being faced with one of the crack German divisions, I guess. But, you know, by this time the Germans had taken a lot of casualties, and even though it was a first-class regiment or division, they had a lot of replacements, and they were scraping the bottom of the barrel manpower.
Okay. Did you witness or were you aware of any of this shooting of prisoner stuff? That
I was not, and if it had ever started to happen on my watch, it wouldn't have gone on but about 2 shots. I heard later, this was long after the war, that one of the soldiers that I trusted went back with a group of 4 prisoners, and the rumor is that he shot all of them. I would never have tolerated anything like that.
Okay. Now, I kind of envision this being a battle for a peak and then a battle for another peak. Was there a lull between peaks, or did you fight your way down the hill and back up the next side?
No, once we took this ridge, that was the end of our responsibility on this particular operation. And other units, other companies and so on, finished up the thing, and I'd say by noon, everything was quiet and the battle had moved on and others were carrying it, and we were ordered to dig in along this ridge that we'd taken, which we did, and we were there, I can't remember, it was days though we were there, and we did a little patrolling at night, listening patrols and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But
now, after the encounter with the machine gun nest, did you have time to think about this horrible thing that you'd just done, or was it such that, okay, now I just have to keep going? Or
well, you know, I thought about it, but you know, when it's them or you, maybe you don't want to do it, and maybe you regret doing it, but nevertheless, you did it, and you do it again in the same situation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that was like February the 21st, and then Dallas Bay was like 5 or 6 March.
Yeah, whenever. I really don't remember the dates.
Okay. Then you got the Silver Star for that, correct?
Yeah, that machine gun thing, yeah.
And when does one know that one's been put up for an award? I mean,
Well, I didn't know about any of this stuff until basically after the war. And when I was in the hospital in Menlo Park, I began getting these notices that you've been awarded this and you've been awarded that, but I never did hear about the Silver Star until, it was in the 1990s, after I'd been to Sun Valley. One of the other officers in our company had sent clippings home to his parents, and one of them told about Lieutenant Creaghe being awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, and for an earlier action, I think on Mount Gorgolesco, he received the Silver Star. But I never did get anything official about the Silver Star.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Now, at this point, were you still? When did you become the assistant company commander?
Well, I became I was still a platoon leader, but the company executive officer had been wounded on the approach march to this place, and so he was out of action. And whether I was considered the executive officer then, I don't remember. But that first night on Gorgolesco, when we were pinned down, our company commander, in essence, deserted and wanted me to desert with him, which I refused to do and crawled back up to where my platoon was. And then when that was all over, for a brief few days, I was the company commander, and then they sent Lieutenant St. Louis from another company or battalion, I forget which, and he had a lot more seniority, and I think Colonel Woolley had a lot more confidence in him, and he took over, and he was very concerned, that, how would I feel, because he was taking over, and it didn't bother me any.
Okay. Without mentioning names, what became of that captain?
Well, he came back up 3 or 4 days after the battle, and we were dug in and enjoying ourselves, sitting in the sun and so on. And he wanted me to write a commendation saying what a wonderful officer he was. And I looked at him and I took a sheet of paper and I wrote that Captain so-and-so always was an exemplary officer in discharging the paperwork and other things connected with the company. And I handed it back to him, and he said, well, I can't use this. I said, well, that's all you're going to get from me. And he left, and I never saw him again. But I understand, as so often happens, that he got promoted to a major and was put in charge of a trucking company.
So you were acting company commander at that time when he came up to ask for the...
Yeah.
Where'd he been?
Well, I don't know. in the rear, where it was safe.
Okay. So now, what was Company B's assignment on Dallas Bay? What was your...
Well, there were B Company and C Company, I think, were the attacking echelons, and then I suppose A Company and the Heavy Weapons Company were back here in the rear somewhere. And we moved up all day, and I remember we moved through one small valley that had, the Germans had good vision on, and they were firing 88 rounds periodically. Well, we were moving across this field when 88 rounds started coming in. We took cover behind a great big boulder, and those rounds, it had rained or the snow had just melted, and the ground was really soft, and the rounds would hit the mud, throw up mud, but they didn't explode, which was very fortunate for us. And then I don't know, I remember seeing a half a dozen of those things hit the mud, throw up mud, and did not explode. And then, I don't know, then there weren't any more rounds. Maybe they'd been overrun or something, and we got up and moved on.
Was this direct fire? They could see you and shooting straight at you? This wasn't arching artillery type?
I'm sure it was a direct line of sight, because an 88, the German 88 was a direct line of sight weapon.
In the movies, the 88s have a very distinctive sound. Were you aware of anything like that?
Well, just recognized it was an 88.
Yeah.
I can't tell you too much about the distinctive sounds.
Okay.
But you could tell an incoming round at night particularly, because they would kind of, as they were going over, and then our counter battery fire was more a shh.
Okay. What's it like to be shelled by artillery? What is it?
Well, after we took a midterm executive heading for Dallas Bay, was that? Yeah. We cleaned off this hilltop, which was very lightly defended, and they had waist-high trenches. And basically, a large part of our company was in those waist-high trenches when mortar shells started coming in. And the only cover we had was from the waist down, so all of us were bent over, lying on the back and the rear end of the man in front of us. And that went on long enough that the torture of your legs and standing like that was excruciating. But fortunately, not one of those mortar shells fell into to the trench complex. It was just, dumb luck.
And then it just stops, and then you get up and go?
Well, as soon as the mortar barrage stopped, we got up and moved on. And I can't remember. Well, then we launched I guess at that time, but other soldiers would have an entirely different recollection of this. But as I remember, then we launched the all-out assault on Delaspay, and Carl Carrick's platoon was on the left, and I had taken command of the first platoon. No, he was on the right and I was on the left, and we had a preparatory artillery barrage, and they were supposed to stop precisely at a certain time, and it didn't stop, and we knew time was running out. Carl got on the radio and screamed at him, God damn it, cut off that barrage, we're moving out. And it stopped, and whew, away we went up to the crest and cleared that off, and then we left people, to watch what was going on. We fell back below the crest and started digging in, which we did.
Was this all after dark?
No, it was still daylight then. And I remember the officers and others were huddling here, assigning sectors and so forth and so on when mortar shells started coming in. So we all hit the dirt. And one exploded so close to me that I could feel the heat in my inner thighs because I was spraddled out like this, and it didn't touch me. It didn't touch anybody else either.
Now, what are the basic principles of once you take a crest, how do you defend it? What are the basic principles?
You keep men posted right where there are always places where behind a boulder somewhere you can see down the other slope without being exposed yourself. And you leave those people doing that, and then everybody else falls back below the crest and starts digging in. And believe me, you dig as fast as you can dig.
Because you're anticipating a counterattack, I presume.
The first counterattack came that night when it was full dark. And we were fortunate there, But on the other hand, we were in control of the crest, and if they tried to counterattack then, we'd have had all the advantage.
How many counterattacks did you get that night?
That night we got, as I recall, and others tell me because I was in and out, I regained consciousness. And
When were you injured?
Okay, the first counterattack, it was full dark. Les McDermott, who was my platoon guide, he was a staff sergeant, and he and I loved him like a brother. He and I were out together inspecting the people, and it was, as you would expect, we found some of them asleep, instead of, we were nudging them awake and moving on down. All of a sudden this counterattack hit, and God, you could just see muzzle flashes all over the place. And we started firing back, of course, and people were throwing grenades, and I don't know whether it was a mortar shell or what, but landed very close to me. And I felt like I was in a concrete mixer. That was my only sensation. Then my next sensation was hitting the ground like that, and probably I was just blown flat, And I was fully conscious, but I knew there was something wrong with my leg, and I reached down and, that wet pop you get of blood coming through cloth, and I thought, the only thought I had, I didn't have any fear, I thought, God, this is a hell of a place to die. And then, I relaxed. the rest of the people beat off the counterattack, and then I called up and said, Sergeant McDermott and I are down here wounded, so be careful, don't throw any grenades down here. And somebody crawled down and dragged me to a foxhole, and that's where I spent the rest of the night, sometimes conscious and sometimes unconscious. And during one of the counterattacks, one of the platoon sergeants or squad leaders panicked, and he started screaming, we had to evacuate, we had to fall back. And my job then, fortunately I was conscious, was to, shout at them, if we give it up tonight, we're going to have to retake it tomorrow morning. And fortunately, everybody held firm.
Okay. And then you were just kind of going in and out?
Going in and out, and I wasn't really aware of the third and fourth counterattacks at all, but I heard later that the last counterattack, the German soldiers that they killed and whose bodies they found, they had lunch with them, and they thought they'd overrun us and retake the objective. But a kid is always often just a kid, even by my standards. Some 18-year-old, he was a BAR man, which is a heavy weight automatic weapon. The last counterattack, he stood up and turned that BAR on its side and held the trigger down, and I guess he really mowed him down. And that was it. That broke the back.
So those attacks were supported by mortars?
Yeah. Of course, the mortars would be before they got there. When their troops got to the objective, of course, they stopped firing mortar rounds. But in the meantime, our mortars were firing over, trying to hit in the area where their troops might be concentrating.
Mm-hmm. And you were wounded a couple of times that night?
Well, I picked up, 11 or 12 shrapnel wounds from that mortar shell. But as I was being evacuated, they moved me on a stretcher not far away. Carl Caracas was there, and Captain Johnson, and for some reason they stopped and about that time, this was full morning, a mortar shell hit in a tree, and of course it sprayed the area with shrapnel, and another piece hit me in the hip, and that was the second time.
You remember talking to Carl and the Captain Johnson?
Yeah. He has one memory of it, and I have another memory. Captain Johnson had always wanted a P-38, and that was a pretty nifty looking German pistol, and a lot of the kids in the platoon and so on would get these P-38s, and they knew I liked P-38s, so they were giving me these P-38s, and I had one with me that night in my jacket, and Captain Johnson came along. He was talking to me, and I pulled that P-38, and he said, "Here's the P-38 you wanted, Captain." I had enormous admiration for him. He was the best senior officer I ever served under.
What was his role at that time?
I think he was a battalion, he was on the battalion staff by that time anyway.
Okay. Now, talk about a battlefield. Let's pick that one. What do they sound like, smell like, feel like?
Well, at the time of the actual battle, of course, it's all noise and confusion and shouting and screaming. I guess we screamed a lot, relieving the tension and fighting down our own panic, I guess. But the minute that was over, you'd calm down. The thing that amazed me, paper. There was paper everywhere. And to this day, I don't understand where all that paper came from. Some of it seemed to be letters, and some of it toilet paper, and I don't know what most of it was. 'Cause, you know, I didn't have time to stop and pick it up. But then, you know, there will be dead lying around, your own dead and German dead, and you collect your own dead and your own wounded and get them off as fast as you can back to the aid station or the collecting point. The German dead, we left them there, and it got cold at night, and they froze. And I'm talking about now after Gorgolesco. And I remember one kid, again another kid. They were all kids that did this. He came up with his mess tin and or whatever he was eating, and he couldn't find any place to sit, so he sat on a dead German. You know, well, that's the
Well, and so you were taken off the hill. Where do you remember what your chain of events after that? Where did you go to the aid station? Where did you have a surgery? What?
Well, I guess obviously I went to the aid station, but I think I was unconscious most of the way. But when I got down to the aid station, they were doing triage, you know, which is the ones that have died, move them off to the side. The ones that need immediate care but will survive, they take them in. Then there are the other wounded. They're wounded, they need care, but they'll be okay out here for an hour or whatever it takes. And I was one of the group that they said, well, he'll survive. So I was out there on a stretcher. I was just, you know, I suppose I lapsed in and out, but I was comfortable, you know. And I was back at the aid station. All of us thought, if we get wounded, if we get back to the aid station, we're probably going to be all right. And I was lying there, and the Catholic chaplain for our battalion, or maybe it was a regiment, I don't remember, came by and knelt down. He said, "Lieutenant, have you made your peace with God?" Which I thought was an odd thing to say. And I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, chaplain, I made my peace with God long before I got here." And kind of turned my face away from him, and he took the hint and left.
So then you finally got surgery at that level, or?
Yeah. Boy, that was painful because, you know, they had to take you off the stretcher and put you up on an x-ray table so they could see where the fragments, they could see where they went in, but they didn't know where they were then. And you were having to change position all the time. Of course, they were helping you, and by that time, boy, every move hurt. But that was finally over, and then they knocked me out and operated on me, I guess. When I came to, I had bandages. In fact, I think my whole leg was bandaged, and I had, I don't know, 7 or 8 wounds in my right leg, and a couple in my hip and one in my chest. And I was very fortunate because the fragment had gone through my arm there into my chest and had lodged near the heart. It was a small fragment. And they said, well, it's not doing any harm there, so then it would be risky to take it out. So they just left it there, and it's still there today.
Remember any pain around your face or anything?
Well, my right eye had been blinded by a shell fragment that had hit, I guess, in my brow and then deflected down into the eye. They took that out.
Now, where was all this surgery happening? Do you remember?
Well, all this surgery was done at what I call the aid station. It was a MASH unit, I guess, you know, like in the TV series.
Battalion level care, or?
Well, I think that was set up for the whole regiment, but I'm not sure. Right. They had several tents, of course. After this great battle on Mount de la Spey, there were wounded everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Then where did you go from there?
From there, after a brief period of time, several days, they loaded us into ambulances and they took us to, I think they took us all the way to Naples, because I remember the only view I got of Florence was through the ambulance window, and I remember being struck by the beautifully gowned Italian women that I glimpsed as we were driving by, because of course by that time the battle had been long beyond Florence for a long time.
Mm-hmm. And then how did you get back to the United States?
Well, after X days or weeks or whatever, we were loaded into a cargo plane and started back, and we spent the first night in, I think, Casablanca. And then the second day, I guess we went all the way on and landed, and we were offloaded in Coral Gables, and I spent 2 or 3 days in a very nice hotel, had a room all to myself in a luxury hotel in Coral Gables. Then they decided where they would send us depending on our injuries, and they gave me several possibilities: Fitzsimmons or Menlo Park in California. And I ended up in, anyway, Dibble General Hospital in Menlo Park.
Fly or train? How did you get there?
I think they flew us. Again, I'm not sure how we got there.
Do you remember being able to talk to your parents at any point in this phase? When did you first get to talk to them?
Probably when I got to Menlo Park, I suppose, because I don't recall. But an officer who had been wounded at the same time, but was fully ambulatory, had gotten back to the States before I did, and he called my parents and told them, that I was basically okay and alive and would be back in the States soon.
They'd probably gotten a generic telegram or something before then.
Yeah, they had, and they'd also gotten an email, those letters, not the email
V-mail.
today. V-mail, yeah. And I mentioned, I said I look like Wiley Post now, because, he only had one eye. And that's about it.
Okay. And how long were you in Menlo Park at that hospital?
Oh, I think I got there probably in, let's see, it was April, probably in June, and I was there until October.
Okay.
That was good duty, because we were all ambulatory by that time, and we had unlimited leave in the evening. Once we'd had our physical exam or follow-up surgery or whatever, then we were free until the next appointment. And as soon as we got our bearings, we started taking the commuter train into San Francisco, and we'd eat and drink and come back to the hospital at Menlo Park.
Did you require further surgeries?
Yeah, they did some further operating on my eye, but by that time there wasn't much that they could do, and all the stitches and everything had been taken out of my leg. But during the ward I was in, there were 3 or 4 captains and several lieutenants, and one of the captains had been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, and was shortly thereafter flown back to Washington, D.C., and when he came back, he had a big glossy print of himself and other Congressional Medal of Honor winners, and his was being pinned on by President Truman. Of course, I assume they did that for everybody, but boy, we were impressed, because, God, he had been wounded. They were taking this objective in this town. He'd been wounded, but there was a machine gun nest in the basement of a building, and there was a window there. And he ran across the intervening distance and dived headfirst through the window with his rifle and grenades, and I gather really killed a whole bunch of people, and in essence cleaned out the cellar himself. and survived, though it was at that time, but he lost his eye completely and had various other wounds too. But boy, he deserved the Congressional Medal, I'll tell you.
Do you remember his name?
No.
Okay. So, and during that time you visited your brother in San Diego, Coronado?
Yeah, yeah. A lieutenant colonel that was in the ward lived in San Diego, and he had a convertible, and I asked him, if he'd take me to Coronado with him because my brother was stationed there, and he said, sure. So we went, and he let me off at the ferry, and I took the ferry over to Coronado, which that's all there was then. And Larry had told me, I can't remember whether he met me or not, but he said, I'm at the Hotel del Coronado, which was as posh then as it is now, just in a little bit different era. He had a room all to himself up on the third floor, whatever it was. And I thought, boy, the Navy officers lived a lot better than infantry officers did.
When did you get out of the Army?
I think it was sometime in October.
Of 45?
Yeah.
So the war was over by then.
Oh yeah.
VE
But
and
they
even
were,
VJ, everything.
They were still. I guess they weren't even. No, they didn't even have to worry about Japan by then.
Yeah, that was August.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I remember the 10th was slated to go on to Japan, and just a couple of years ago, a friend of a friend had gone to the archives, and the preliminary battle estimates of casualties and so on had been prepared for a landing of Japan, and they were declassified by that time. And he made a copy and then had others made, and one of them eventually, through the fellow across the street, ended up in my hands. And God, it would have probably cost us a million casualties, they estimated at least, and who knows how many dead. And they had every conceivable defense of that island that could be planned for, mini submarines, scuba divers that would carry limpet bombs and so on, and oh, that would have been terrible. And they, by that time, of course, we'd used the atomic bomb before these, or had we? No, we hadn't. We hadn't used the atomic bomb when these plans were drawn up, so they envisioned just straight infantry fighting because, of course, nobody knew about the atomic bombs. Mm-hmm. And they estimated in their battle plan that when it was over, assuming we were successful, Japanese culture would have ceased to exist because the whole island would have just been totally devastated.
Okay, you got the Distinguished Service Cross for what happened on Delos Bay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, after you got out of the Army, what'd you do?
I went back to school in Boulder because I'd graduated, but I wanted to get a teaching certificate because at that time I thought I wanted to teach on the lower levels, and I had to get a certificate first, which I did in a desultory fashion, I must admit, enjoying being in Boulder.
What was it like, or how was the CU different after the war than it was before the war?
Well, of course, there were hundreds, if not, hundreds of veterans that were going to school on the GI Bill. And a lot of us, we still had uniforms, khakis and pinks and the green shirts and all that sort of thing that we had. And so everywhere you went, you saw people, veterans, togged out and part of their stuff that they'd had in the Army.
You actually received the DSC at CU?
Yeah.
What was that like?
Well, Walt Franklin, who was a captain, and it was a faculty member in the business school, had been let out by that time, and I got this notification that I could be awarded the DSC at a place of my choosing, and so I said, well, I think right here in Boulder, and the Boulder Theater, and Captain Walt Franklin organized a color guard, and he was in his uniform and I was in mine, and we went over there, and I notified my parents, and there were other spectators there, and he gave me the Distinguished Service Cross. And,
so your parents did make it for that?
yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, and then you went on to teach at the college level, was that?
Well, first I taught at a high school in Alliance, Nebraska, and I didn't like teaching at that level at all because you had to be a disciplinarian, and I had no taste for being a disciplinarian, so I eventually went to graduate school and got my doctorate, and from then on I taught at the college level.
And where did you get your doctorate?
University of Maryland.
Okay, now let's just talk about special, kind of overall kinds of things. Do you think you were changed as a human being by